1961, instigated by the head of Paris police, Maurice Papon, a Nazi collaborator as head of the police in Bordeaux. He was a torturer of FLN fighters against French colonial rule when he was a civil servant in charge of province in Algeria. He was also a French cabinet minister in '78. I don't know if people know about the Paris massacre of 1961. It is one of those little hidden bits of history. Simone de Beauvoir, great feminist, socialist, she wrote about that incident. She described it. The police waited for the Algerians to come up out of the metro stations, made them stand with their hands above their heads and hit them with truncheons. Corpses were found hanging in the Bois de Boulogne, and others disfigured and mutilated in the Seine. The government has since admitted it killed 40 people that night. It's believed the true figure is more like 200, and literally bodies were found floating in the Seine. I don't have time to go into details, but look it up. There's a photo of the graffiti on Saint-Michel Bridge. Ici on noie les Algériens. Here we drown Algerians. Papon was convicted of crimes against humanity for his role in deporting 1,600 Jews to concentration camps under the Vichy regime, but there's never been any inquiry, criminal or otherwise, into the killing of those Algerians. So, of course, the state picks the crimes that it describes as terrorism. And as one of my clients said, the first case I had, a domestic homicide case, the family were due to come and see me on the day of the 7/7 bombings, and they couldn't travel that day. And when he came to see me, we were in the full flood of needing this and that, enhancing police powers. And he said, you know, they talk about the war on terrorism, or what my sister went through. That was terror. Where's the war on the terror against people like my sister? So, I'm going to talk about the majestic inequality of the law in relation to women. And I'm just going to highlight two important lessons for us all as lawyers, and as campaigners, and as citizens. The first is you get the legal system you fight for. Put another way, change doesn't come from the law. I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody sitting in the room this, but it is worth remembering. The law only changes under pressure from the struggles and the resistance of ordinary people outside of the courts. And under pressure, even with an unjust political and economic system, you can achieve real victories. And those victories are worth fighting for. And indeed, without the struggles for those victories, you won't build a struggle to create change at a much higher level. So, yes, we need to understand the way that the law reflects and protects existing relations within society, but that doesn't mean we need to be fatalistic and deterministic about it and think that no change is possible. The reality is you can fight and you can change. And hopefully, I think Helen Steel, hopefully is going to come at some point. She's going to be on the panel this morning. She's a very living example of that. Yes. Oh, she's there. That was good timing. The second is you can't take anything for granted, because what you win with one hand, the state will take away with the other. So you have to keep up the fight, and you have to keep up the fight, because you can win victories and they'll be taken away. So, because of time, I'm going to focus on domestic violence. As Gareth has said, that's an entirely inadequate description of it, but it is with the domestic abuse, male violence against women. I'm going to call it domestic violence. I'm mostly talking about physical violence, not sexual violence, mostly. There's one exception to that, but that's what I'm going to focus on. So, first, the scale of the problem. Official homicide statistics since 2001 show that on average 2 women are killed every week by a current or former partner in the UK. 2 women a week. 77 women were killed by their partners or ex-partners in 2012-13. Domestic violence is the largest cause of morbidity worldwide in women aged 19 to 44, greater than war, cancer or road accidents put together. 29%, so nearly a third of women in the UK, have experienced physical and or sexual violence by a current or previous partner. We have the 4th worst statistics in the EU. Domestic violence is gendered violence. Women have been found to constitute 89% of all those who experience 4 or more incidents of domestic violence. The figures for a single act, it's slightly more evenly distributed, and often that reality is used by the state to say, oh, look, you know, cuts both ways. Men are victims too. But the reality of sustained violence is that women are overwhelmingly, 89%, for 4 or more incidents. And we also know that men have recourse to the law and get a much more sympathetic hearing from the law than women, in any event. It's a feature of domestic violence that women would have experienced it on very many occasions before a report to the police is made. On average, figures suggest 35 times. The relevance of that in terms of the law is that by the time a woman has made her first complaint to the police, the reality is that the risk to her life is likely to have escalated. 1 in 7 children and young people under the age of 18 will have lived with domestic violence, and consistent studies show that domestic violence adversely affects children's development, relationships, behaviour, emotional well-being. Domestic violence is a factor in the family backgrounds of 2/3 of the series case reviews. They're the inquiries that are conducted when a child has died. The impact of domestic violence has devastated those who experience it and for children who witness it, and in addition it is a huge societal burden. Crime related to domestic abuse constitutes about 8% of all recorded crime, and about one third of all recorded assaults leading to an injury. On average, the police receive an emergency call related to domestic abuse every 30 seconds, and domestic violence has been estimated to cost the taxpayer 15.7 billion a year. We don't have to worry about that, of course, because we've got the tampon tax. So is the state failing women? And does the cliche of it's a domestic, we don't need to worry about it, still exist? Yes, resoundingly yes. And the statistics have really barely changed since the 70s. I guess the only thing you can say, being rigorously empirical about it, is that the population has risen since then, and the number hasn't gone up. That's about as good as it gets on the statistical domestic violence. I haven't got time to go into great detail about failings, the state's failings, but, for example, the Inspector of Constabulary conducted a national investigation of police forces' performance on domestic violence in 2014 and produced its report, and it found a whole litany of failings across forces. Its conclusions were the overall police response to victims of domestic abuse is not good enough, it's a priority on paper, but the majority of forces don't put it into practice. They have marvellous policies lying gathering dust on shelves. Oh my God, 5 minutes. Okay. And the most important, remembering the Out of France quote, domestic abuse too often remains a poor relation to acquisitive crime and serious organised crime. So acquisitive crime, crimes against property, are treated more seriously than crimes against women. Behind all this, of course, there are real women and children. I did have a list of 8 cases just from 2008. I haven't got time to go through them all, but there's a whole series of cases where the state was found to have failed and the failings to have contributed to the deaths. I'll give you just one example because I know it well. It's one of my cases, the case of Maria Stubbings. She was strangled to death by her ex-partner. He had arrived in the UK and been deported from Germany after being released from jail for another serving life for a domestic homicide. Because it was committed in Germany, he arrived here with no conditions, but the police knew about him. They were alerted straight away. He assaulted her, he was dealt with and went to jail for assaulting her, got back out, started making contact with her again. She got back in touch with the people who dealt with her before. He's back, I need to do something. Police were useless. He killed her. Her body was hidden in the downstairs toilet for 3 days. Her 15-year-old son was in the house. Unbeknown to him, his mother's dead body was buried under a pile of coats in the downstairs loo, and the killer was in the house with him for the 3 days, and he couldn't work out why he kept following around. And he was terrified he was going to find the woman's body, and he could so easily end up dead as well. And a jury found a great list of failings by the police. So that's it. Struggle to call the police to account. Is an interesting one which I've got time to go into now. But basically, I'll give you a condensed, potted version. There has been a long struggle to hold the police to account for negligence, because actually in many ways what they do is they're negligent. They don't necessarily consciously think, well, hey, we're really glad that woman's been killed. It's negligent, they're just useless, they don't treat it seriously, they don't see it as a priority, so they're just careless. Classically, that should be negligence, but classically the courts refuse to hold the police to account for negligence. And the key case that's cited is the case of Hill, which was brought by the mother of the last victim of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, who killed 13 women, attempted to kill a whole number of other women. It's a very good account of the mindset of the police that allowed him to carry on his operations over it's about 8 years, I think, period. He was first picked up in 79, he wasn't arrested 69. He wasn't arrested till 81. So it's longer than that, but he wasn't killing, I don't think, till about 75. Anyway, that's a whole history of failings. Joan Smith's book, Misogynies, gives a very good account of the mindset of the police and what they thought a killer of women looks like. You know, he's got mad staring eyes, he's a loner, doesn't have any friends. In fact, everyone said, oh, he's quite a nice bloke, Peter Sutcliffe, he's married. So they picked him up 9 times, Peter Sutcliffe, because he matched what they were looking for, except objectively, but when they saw him, they just like, can't. So she brought a claim, and the court said, no, we're not having the police held liable for negligence. We cannot have the police worried about being sued. Might make them do their job better. In fact, they said, everybody knows the police do their job as well as they possibly can. And they never in a million years do something careless. So there we go. So then we have a series of cases brought by people who are denied equal protection from the law. So we have Dwayne Brooks, the friend of Stephen Lawrence, who brought a challenge the police's immunity from suit because of the way they treated him. And the Lawrence inquiry accepted that what happened when the police arrived was he was stereotyped. He couldn't believe when the police turned up. Where was the ambulance? Why is the police here? We need an ambulance. So he was incredibly agitated. He had just witnessed his son, his best friend, being murdered. He was obviously nearly the subject of a fatal attack. And the police said, oh, he's very angry black man. And the Lawrence inquiry found that he was stereotyped. They saw a black youth. They assumed it had been a fight. So they assumed it was a classic thing that the victim becomes perpetrator. And so he brought his claim in negligence, and the House of Lords said no, we're not having the police in negligence. They couldn't quite buy the line that was put at in Hill. They accepted the police don't always use their best endeavours, but they said, don't worry, we've got the IPCC now, which has just come in. So, of course, since then we've seen how the IPCC fails in these situations. And the next person to challenge it was a gay man who was facing horrific threats of violence from a previously violent partner. And he was not, he brought a claim, he survived, but he was subject to a brutal attack with a hammer. And he brought a claim, and again, they said no. And the reason I'm going to mention Smith, I'm just going to cite what the House of Lords said, because dealing with a case of a gay man facing domestic abuse, they talked about domestic violence. And they said, I've only got 2 minutes, but it's such an outrageous quote. They said, sorry about this. Lord Carswell said, one must recognise that police officers may quite properly be slow to engage themselves too closely in domestic type matters. They may suspect from experience the existence of a degree of hysteria or exaggeration. That's made me gasp. And most recently, the family of a woman killed by her ex-partner brought a challenge. And actually, the good thing is that every time these cases have been fought, the courts have kind of found a narrower and narrower basis to justify the basis on which they're saying the police can't be held. And the most recent case, they again upheld. They said there was no duty of care. They said there's no immunity. They said on the facts of this case there's no duty of care. But watch this space. That battle has not been lost. It's you know. The battle was lost, but the war isn't over. And just one final thing on the property relations of society. One of the key cases that has succeeded against the state was brought by owners of yachts because their yachts were damaged, and it's like the war was re-traumatising. And so there were these. It was in the day of Borstal. There were these Borstal boys who were taken on a trip So we're not, it is, shouldn't really laugh, but it's quite a fun story. They were taken on a trip, you know, let's reintegrate into society, off on Brownsea Island, and they escaped. They had a bit of a history of escaping. And they escaped, and they nicked someone's yacht to escape on the yacht, and they crashed into someone else's yacht. And it lived up to then. No, stop. So the state is held liable. The struggle's not over. Louise Christian is here somewhere. There she is. She brought a case in Vedgeworth, Strasbourg, that held under the Human Rights Act. The state can be held liable, and we are now using Article 2, the right to life, to call the state to account, both for proper inquiries and also to compensate the families, in particular to provide adequately for children who are left bereaved by domestic violence. Harriet Wistrick at Bernberg's, Gareth's firm, has brought a challenge to the failure to investigate rape, very similar circumstances to the Bede Sutcliffe, and the police were held to account successfully, and the court will upheld that. So, and Dwayne Brooks won in a claim under the Race Relations Act, which of course only came into force because of the struggle of the black community in West London against racists, and as a result of those struggles and a bus boycott when they wouldn't allow black people to drive buses, the Race Relations Act came in, and that was used by Dwayne Brooks, so he did succeed in his fight. So the fight's not over, but of course we have to keep fighting. To prove my other little point I was going to weave into my talk, we have to keep fighting. I'm the last sentence. I know. So all I was going to say was, of course, the Tories want to repeal the Human Rights Act, so we have to fight that to defend what we've done.
Thank you, Sarah, because you talked so quickly, you actually had much longer than everyone thought you had. So thank you for that enormous contribution, exceptionally interesting and informative. Now we have the luck to have Laura here. I think she has a PowerPoint.
I do if it works.
Is it achievable?
And if it doesn't, I'll just talk.
We're very lucky to have Laura here, who has spent a lifetime campaigning.
No, we don't campaign.
Question.
It's okay. We're not a campaigning group. Sorry, we're just really clear about that.
You're not having a PowerPoint.
No, I am having a PowerPoint. But we're not a campaigning organization. Oh, sorry. Do you know what organization? It's when it starts.
I said she was an activist, or maybe I didn't. If I didn't, I apologise profusely. But she brings to this conference the experience of her work in both the United States and the UK, and consequently brings a dimension that maybe nationally we sometimes lack, when the issue to be combated is never-ending throughout all of our lives. And it is hoped not through all of our children's lives. So thank you.
Hi. Who doesn't like to talk about abortion on a Sunday morning? So, my name is Mara. I'm the founder and director of the Abortion Support Network. And we are an abortion fund. An abortion fund is an organization that believes that I don't have enough money for an abortion shouldn't be the only reason you become a parent. We are financed by individual donors. We're a tiny charity working to meet a large-scale problem, which is the thousands of women and girls in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the Isle of Man who need abortions and face a combination of draconian abortion laws and poverty. And we do this with a mobile phone, a website, a database, a director who, as of this year, is paid part-time, and wonderful, generous people who give their time and money because they believe what we believe. Why do we exist? Because people with money have options, and people without money have babies, or drink bleach, or overdose, or try and crash their cars, which, we don't like it. Making abortion against the law doesn't stop it. In no way does it stop it. It just means that, again, women with money have options, women without money have babies, and it makes it an economic issue, completely an economic issue. We are not doctors or counselors or legal professionals. I never do PowerPoints, but I was a little intimidated by coming and standing in front of people who know legal things, so I thought you might like some numbers and charts. But what we are experts in is the human cost of restrictive abortion laws. If we weren't here, well, these are the things people have done before contacting us. We can talk academically about the hardship faced by these people, but the reality is way worse than you can imagine. Whether it's the mother of 4 who told us matter-of-factly, trying to figure out how to crash my car to cause a miscarriage but not permanently injure myself or die, or the woman who found poison under her 16-year-old's bed. She hadn't known her daughter was pregnant until that point. I think my page is wrong there. Did I just? No. Okay, so this is how we work. Somebody contacts us by phone, email, or text message. We contact them back because many of them are calling us from pay-as-you-go mobile phones. We give them information on how to arrange the least expensive abortion and travel, because if you're just going on the internet or calling people, you don't know about things like reduced rates at a lot of clinics for people traveling over. You don't know that if you come over here, you have to pay for a consultation, but if you go to this place or that place at home, you don't have to. And you also might not know about how to get safe but illegal early medical abortion pills online. We do make it clear to them that it is against the law to take these pills, but it's a heck of a lot easier than getting a visa if you're a refugee, or finding somebody to watch your 6 kids. We do a financial assessment, and we give money when they need it. If they need to stay overnight, which most of them don't, we have hosts that put them up in their homes, including Anya over here, who's also one of my trustees. Yay, Anya! And then if we're going to give them money, we arrange the grant with the clinic. And it's simple on paper, and sometimes it's simple in practice. Sometimes somebody calls us and they say, yeah, I've got together this much, and I called the clinic, and the flights are cheap on this day, and I found somebody to watch our kids, and then literally in 15 minutes we have them sorted. And sometimes the process can take weeks or months. And as you get further along in pregnancy, the price doubles and then triples. So you're sort of chasing the fee. And this could be due to needing a visa, needing to wait until the kids are back in school, waiting until an abusive partner goes away overnight. So, we sort of do what we can as we can. So there it is. That's where our clients are from. It's basically 2/3 the Republic, 1/3 Northern, under 1% from the Isle of Man, and then 8.5% from all over the world. Who can get help from us? Anyone can get practical information and advice, and funding is awarded on a case-by-case basis, depending on financial need. We don't ask clients how they got pregnant or why they want abortions. We don't even ask if they're women. Our only criteria for funding are financial need and available funds. And since we started in 2009, we've heard from over 2,200 people, and we're incredibly proud to say we haven't had to turn somebody down due to lack of funds since 2012, which is pretty incredible when you consider that all our money comes from private individuals. Charts. So this is basically how many people we've heard from, how many we've funded, how many we've hosted. You can see the numbers aren't going down. It costs between £400 to £2,000 to travel and pay privately for a termination. We're able to help a lot of people without giving them any money, either by telling them how to arrange it less expensively, how to get pills on the internet. And that's the main reason why we tend to only fund 25% of the people who contact us. There's a lot of people who we don't help because we can't help them. We can't make the Home Office process a visa. We can't lock their abusive partner in a closet. And sometimes people just disappear and we don't chase. We'll follow up, but then, people might decide to continue the pregnancy. That's pro-choice. This is how much money we've given. Again, those numbers are not going down. We're giving a lot more money away this year, partly because we have more money. Our grants have ranged from £20 to over £2,200. £2,200 doesn't terrify me, £20 does. Can you imagine being in Ireland or Northern Ireland thinking that if you turn up over here with £20, you're not going to be seen, that £20 is the difference between having a baby or not having a baby. So, this is who we've helped. We don't ask clients how they got pregnant or why they want abortions again, so this information is incomplete. It's the result of information that clients volunteer to us. People always ask what our average client is, and there just isn't an average client. They range in age from 13 to 51. 51 wasn't the menopause, actually. But they do have 4 things in common. They were pregnant, they want to end their pregnancy, they're poor, and poverty can mean a lot of different things. It can mean, you're living in a direct provision, or in a refugee, in a women's refuge, or it can mean you have a white-collar job, but you're supporting 4 kids, 2 parents, and a grandkid. And they never in a million years thought they'd be calling strangers in England and begging for money. The other thing is our clients tend to be later term. Again, as they're saving money, the price goes up. And so while fewer than 1.4% of terminations in England take place between 20 and 24 weeks, with our clients it's 8%. So these are quotes from actual clients. We're often asked to bring women's stories into a room, but these aren't stories, they're lived experiences. And sometimes I feel that sharing information about our clients, I'm actually perpetuating an additional injustice. Ireland screwed her once and we're screwing her again by breaking her privacy. And at the same time, if we don't talk about the people we hear from, we wouldn't get money. And if we didn't get money, we couldn't provide life-saving assistance. It's also 5 or 2. Awesome. I'm on the second last slide. Told you I talk fast. It's also common that after I speak, someone will invariably come up to me and go, "Come on, Maura, not everybody is raped, not everybody is in an abusive relationship," and they are absolutely correct. Most people who have unplanned pregnancies are not in that circumstance. Most people also have a passport. Someone in their life, they can tell that they're pregnant, money in the bank. But that's not who we hear from. We hear from the really desperate people. We hear from the worst cases, although I'd be hard-pressed to tell you what the worst case is, largely because the benchmark keeps getting moved out. In the last few weeks, we helped a woman come over who spoke 0 English, literally, not 1 word of English, and had £7 for a £1,350 abortion. Thank God she had a passport, but we arranged everything else, including accommodation and somebody to get her from the airport, which we don't usually do, but, needs must. We also helped a mother of 3 with no phone, no telephone, 3 kids, early 20s, no phone. So there is no worst. And I would never want to say what the worst case is, because then another one will come along. But at the same time, there's a lot of joy in this work. The quote down here, "I never understood before how being able to have an abortion can be empowering, but now I do." There's a lot of, we're dealing with real people, and yeah, we're not all putting our heads in the ovens, which is good. And that's it. If you want to help, here's some ways. You can give us money. People are always like, "How do you get people to give you money?" I ask that. You can keep in touch on Twitter and Facebook. You can sign up for a newsletter. You can volunteer, especially if you have a room or a sofa bed in Birmingham, Liverpool, and Manchester. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Maura. Can I ask that not one single person leave this room this morning without giving money somehow?
Any currency.
Any currency, so long as you don't go through the door and risk forgetting. So, thank you very much indeed. Quite extraordinary. Now, Helen, thank you for coming. Helen is someone who has spent a huge percentage of her life as the most serious, committed political campaigner. Years and years ago, she was a hero to us all, in particular to lawyers, for whom she had little time, rightly. But as someone who campaigned against McDonald's, and that stupid, ridiculous organisation saw fit to bring an action for libel against Helen and her comrade. And for 2 years or more in the High Court, Helen and her comrade, who had no means, no ability to have legal aid, to have lawyers, defended their action, and in the process established that everything in the pamphlet that they had used to campaign against McDonald's, against them outside their wretched restaurant, was effectively true. That they produced appalling food from appalling conditions, that they tortured the animals in the process before slaughtering them, that it was a sleazy and disgraceful operation. So McDonald's had cause to regret taking on Helen Steel. It's only years later, and through immense personal courage, which involves speaking here today, that Helen came to realise that she was unknowingly the object of a far more sinister form of state interest than she had previously ever realised. And that related to relationship, personal relationship, which turned out to be with someone who was not who she thought, but a police officer. Now, that is not the only part of the story. I simply want to know that but for Helen, that extraordinary systemic abuse of individuals, more than one, would not be known. Some years ago, it was Helen, the beginnings of the revelation of one undercover officer involved in one abusive relationship, that it was Helen who researched and pulled together a number of women who, putting their stories together, were able to show that it wasn't just one person, it was something tolerated by the police themselves. And that's Helen, did that, she did it. Now, she's going to speak to us and simply respect her, applaud her, honour her, for even being able to do what most of us would never do, never be able to do, not just to do all of this, but to have the political integrity to think that it's appropriate to share something so personally devastating to make the wider point to know. So thank you, Helen.
Thank you for your very warm welcome. I hope I can live up to that billing, but I'm going to do a quick run through in case people haven't heard any of the story about what happened to me, but that part will be quite quick before moving on to the wider issue. I had a 2-year relationship with an undercover policeman who I knew at the time as a political activist called John Barker, and it wasn't until 19 years later that I found out he was an undercover policeman. I met him through environmental and social justice activism. We became close friends, and then we started a relationship together, We moved into a flat together, we talked about sharing the rest of our lives, and we talked about starting a family. He declared that he loved me deeply, and I thought that I had met someone who we just seemed to share so much in common that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. Then, after about 18 months, he appeared to be going through some sort of a mental breakdown. He'd be distressed and in tears from time to time, and then he'd keep disappearing, then coming back. And then he finally disappeared altogether, and the last I heard from him was 2 letters that were postmarked from South Africa saying that he couldn't cope with things anymore, but that if he managed to sort his head out, he'd come back. So I was left distraught by this and very worried about his well-being, and I spent a long time trying to find him. I searched through all sorts of records and any lead that I had, and basically everything that I found turned up more questions than answers. And eventually I found that he had been using the identity of a child who died when he was 8 years old. And at that point my world really fell apart, because this was a person who I thought I knew so well. I'd lived with him, and yet actually I didn't even know his name, and it called into question all the other relationships that I had. If someone you're so close to doesn't actually exist, what does that mean about other people who are around you? Do they exist? Are they real? Who can I trust? Who can I talk to about this? It turned my world upside down. I lost the ability to trust my own judgment. I continued my search, and I eventually found out his real name, and that he'd been married, and that at the time of this marriage he was a police officer. And at that point I thought, okay, that answers it. But as I talked to the very few people who I still felt I was able to trust, my close family and close friends, they basically reacted like, no, you're being paranoid here. That sort of thing doesn't happen in this country. There's probably some other far more plausible explanation, like, that he'd been a police officer and he was embarrassed about it when he got involved in political activism, so he just pretended to be someone else. It was very much, people just couldn't believe that this sort of thing would happen in this country. 19 years after he disappeared, I finally found out the truth when a woman who I had known through political activism, through Reclaim the Streets, got in contact with me. She had ended up in a similar abusive relationship and had children with the man who she thought was another activist and who was in fact an undercover policeman. She had ended up escaping to a domestic violence refuge, and she finally managed to make contact with me, and at that point she told me that my former partner had been an undercover policeman, and she knew because her partner had told her. And he also told her about Bob Lambert, who has been exposed to actually lectures on the law and policing, and he had infiltrated London Greenpeace in the 80s, and he'd also had, well, it's now been exposed that he had 4 separate relationships with women while he was undercover, including having a child with one of the women. But at the time she told me this, there was nothing in the papers about it. It wasn't known at all. The Mark Kennedy story, which some of you may remember, was just breaking, where it had been exposed that this man who'd been infiltrating the environmental movement for 7 years had in fact been an undercover policeman, and he'd been in a 6-year relationship with a woman during that time, and with other relationships as well. And he was being portrayed by the police and politicians in media as a rogue officer who'd gone astray and done his own thing. And through the knowledge I had, I obviously knew that was completely false, and so we tried to get together the group of women that we knew about, either that we knew about or that had strong suspicions that the same thing had happened to them, in order to bring a case, to bring this out into the open. And we ended up with 8 of us who had been in relationships with 5 different police officers over a period spanning 25 years, going to Bernberg's, we had Harriet Wistrich as our solicitor, and we all worked together to bring this out into the open and to show that this was systematic abuse, not just individual rogue officers. As we worked together, the patterns really emerged. What we had thought were individual kind of sob stories of, meeting someone who seems to be the person of your dreams, and then them having a breakdown, and then them disappearing. It was the same for all of us. And so, it was clear that these were operational tactics. They weren't, accidental actions of officers that were in love, as was claimed. And we knew as well that we had all been deliberately emotionally manipulated with sob stories about no siblings or parents having died or other crises that they said that they were going through. We then started to talk about the institutional sexism of all of this. How it was that the police came to think that it was okay to use women in this way to shore up the identities, the fake identities of these undercover policemen in order to undermine political movements in this country. And you've got to look at both the canteen culture of the Metropolitan Police, where it's all a bit of a laugh and a joke how women are treated. You've got to look at the fact that the unit that most of these officers came from, the Special Demonstration Squad, which was set up in 1968 and ran until 2008, but the problem's not over, so don't think it is. They had 10 officers a year infiltrating political movements, and of those 10 officers, until Greenham happened, all of them were male. After Greenham Common, when obviously they couldn't infiltrate the Greenham Common women's camps with male officers, they started having 1 or 2 female police officers per year, but it was still a predominantly male unit. And then since that time, since 2008, there's been the National Public Order Intelligence Unit, which then went into the National Domestic Extremism Unit, and we have no confidence that this abuse has actually definitely stopped. So we face exposing the sexism of the police force and the way they use women in this way, and we face the sexism of the legal system, where we learned that if we wanted to bring a claim, the only things that you could claim for were financial loss or psychological harm. Uh-oh, I'm going to be in trouble. I'm in trouble. There's no recognition of the loss of time, the time that we wasted on our lives in these fake relationships. There's no recognition of the loss of opportunity to have children, because most of these relationships were occurring in our 20s and early 30s, which are kind of the prime time when you start thinking about whether or not you want to have children. And obviously, if you can't form relationships, it's a genuine relationship. It's impossible to, well, it's not impossible, but it's much harder to have children. And so, you've got the sexism of the legal system, which takes male values of the most important thing in anyone's life is what they can earn. Not the relationships that they can form or wanting to form a family life. We face the sexism in front of the Home Affairs Select Committee, where when we went to see them and to report on what happened to us, they asked what we've been involved with, what we'd done. They repeatedly asked the senior officer who was present to apologise for the use of dead children's identities, to apologise to the families of those children whose identities had been used by the undercover police. They never once asked her to apologise to us for the relationships that we'd been deceived into. There was clearly an assumption of guilt that we must have brought this upon ourselves. Then we faced the institutional sexism of the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service decision, why they declined to prosecute the men either for sexual assault or for misconduct in public office, because they stated that the relationships were based on genuine feelings of mutual attraction. A response which is utterly inappropriate and insulting. Clearly, the consent to the relationships at the time is entirely negated by the level of deception, not just as to who these men were, but as to the purpose of the relationships, which was to spy on and undermine political movements that we were involved in and felt were important. Just briefly, there have been comparisons made to relationships where men might often lie about their age or their income, and people saying, well, it's not much different to that. But actually, this is massively different. This is about a completely fake person in your life. You know, there's not one thing that's real about them. It's a fake identity, a fake passport, a fake age, fake job, fake political beliefs. Everything about them is fake. So there really is, I mean, no deception, no deceit in a relationship is a good thing. It shouldn't happen, but this is state-sponsored deceit. We had the massive scandal of celebrity phone hacking, which is a recognised invasion of privacy. What one of my colleagues has called for what happened to us is effectively body hacking. They invaded our bodies and they invaded our minds. They had access to our innermost private thoughts, and we've absolutely got no idea of what's on police files now about us. We had the psychological damage of the emotional manipulation we were put through, and through having been used gratuitously. We had the massive grief at their disappearance. It's like a bereavement, only there is no dead person to bury and no kind of formal acknowledgement. You're grieving a person who never really existed. As I said, you've got the destruction of ability to trust in other people. Your whole world crumbles. Everything that you thought was real suddenly becomes unreal. And one of the other really important issues is that the only person who has answers to the muddle that has become of your world is the person who has been abusing you. And that actually really puts at risk the women from the undercover officers coming back into their lives, which did happen, and which is why this woman ended up having, one of the women in our case ended up having children. He came back into her life seeming to hold the answers to all the puzzles, and you know, you're just at huge risk of further emotional abuse. The risk of children being born, as has happened, means that you've got a spy in your life for the rest of your life, because the parents, the man, has parental influence over the child's life. So they can have a say in how your children are brought up, and they can know information about how you're living your life in the future. So, just to try and finish off a bit quicker, so people may have heard that we actually recently had quite a big victory where the Assistant Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police, Martin Hewitt, finally gave a public apology to us where he conceded that officers acting undercover while seeking to infiltrate protest groups entered into long-term intimate sexual relationships with women which were abusive, deceitful, manipulative and wrong. And he also acknowledged that these relationships were a violation of the women's human rights and abuse of police power and caused significant trauma. Now, this, we don't entirely believe the sincerity of this, but the reality is it is a massive victory, because up to this point they have been refusing to confirm or deny that these relationships took place. They have been refusing to confirm or deny that sorry, my mind's gone now. Yeah, they've been refusing to accept any responsibility for these relationships, and they've been refusing to confirm or deny the identities of these officers, except where they're forced to through the legal proceedings. So this apology is a massive step forward, but it's absolutely not enough, because we know that there are more women who were deceived into these relationships. and that all of these relationships need to be exposed. There is now a public inquiry into the abuses of undercover policemen, which will look into not only these relationships but also the use of the children's identity, the use of children's identities who have died. It will look into the infiltration of family campaigns for justice over those who've had loved ones who've died at the hands of the police or through incompetent police investigations. That's also going to look into the links between undercover policing and the creation of blacklisting of trade unionists and other political activists. And this public inquiry is a unique opportunity to get the truth out about undercover policing in this country. But the work has still got a long way to go, and what we need to ensure is that all of the cover names of the undercover officers are brought out into the open, so that any other women or any other people who are abused by the undercover officers know that they are able to come forward with the evidence about what's happened to them, so the true extent of these abuses can be exposed. It's important to remember that these abuses were not exposed by the police or by the Complaints Commission or anything like that. They were exposed by political activists doing research like I did and like some of the other women did, and then by the actions of whistleblowers like Peter Francis, and through journalists like Rob Evans and Paul Lewis at The Guardian, who did the undercover book and who have written a whole series of articles exposing this. And the police and the state have done their utmost to suppress these information about these abuses and keep it undercover, and it's really important that the public inquiry is able to look at the true extent of the abuses. Our key aim in bringing this case was to ensure that this abuse doesn't happen to anybody else in the future, and we're hoping that through having exposed these relationships, it's certainly made it a hell of a lot harder for them to continue this abuse, but we want to make sure that there are proper steps in place to make sure that it can't happen to anybody else, and the public inquiry and exposing the reality of what's happened is a very important part of that. So I think that will be
Despite that taking up an additional 2 minutes, it was appropriate. Due to the complete incompetence of the chair, we now have 9 minutes left for questions. So please raise your hand if you wish.
I'm Peirce and I'm here from the Morning Star.
Microphones.
Hi, thanks very much. Hi, I'm Peirce and I'm here from the features desk at the Morning Star newspaper. It's an absolute pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today, and all of your contributions have been very erudite and deeply moving in a lot of cases as well. I just want to pay particular tribute to Helen for that speech, which I think will stay with me and many of us for the rest of our lives. And thank you for your courage today. And I just wanted to ask you, Helen, you've said, obviously, that your aim is to prevent this ever happening again. a very noble and correct aim. But in the apology that was issued, I think last week by the Met, there was a line in that apology that many people found quite jarring, which I think said that the only time such relationships would be appropriate is if an officer's life was at risk. Now, I wondered what if you feel able to respond, I wondered what your response might be to that particular caveat in that apology. Thank you.
Well, essentially, I think it's completely ludicrous. But they were insistent that there might be circumstances where it could be justified. I mean, none of us can see any circumstances where it can be justified, and nobody yet has put forward any coherent set of circumstances where it would make a difference to someone's life. I mean, it's just utterly ludicrous, but it is what we faced from the start, them seeking to justify this conduct, and only now being forced to admit that there are basically no circumstances in which it's okay.
Any more questions? Yes, front row.
Thank you. I just wanted to, I was a bit puzzled at the beginning of Mara's talk, where you said so categorically that you weren't a campaigner. And given that so many of the women who your excellent organisation supports come from Northern Ireland, which is still part of the UK, and where the 1967 Act doesn't apply, and in the light particularly of the very sort of eloquent argument put forward by Sarah earlier, that in a sense it isn't that we need to campaign to change the law. I wonder why the Abortion Solidarity Network doesn't campaign to change the law on abortion in Northern Ireland.
Thanks for that. I actually made a note to mention that the next time I do this. We're not a campaigning organisation because there's about 25 organisations campaigning for law reform and no other organisation doing what we're doing. We work with the campaigning organisations, we lend support, we speak at their events, we give them case studies, but we're very clear that we are a one-trick pony. We are the right now solution. So while the organisations campaigning for law reform, the Abortion Rights Campaign of the UK, Alliance for Choice in Northern Ireland, Action on X, the Coalition to Repeal the Eighth, I could go on because there's a lot. They're doing amazing work to find a cure for the plaster.
Conduct the two serves up.
Thanks. Thank you very much to all of you for your contributions and the work that you do. My question is for Sarah. Sarah, I'm with you on the issue of state responsibility and accountability, and we need to keep that on the radar, particularly those of us that work in women's human rights. The challenge is at a national level. Litigation is one strategy. And I come from South Africa, where we've had amazing constitutional jurisprudence, including accountability of the police for failure to protect and prevent. In a seminal sexual violence case, the Carmichael case, often it feels like the impact litigation is supposed to serve a greater good, right? And setting good precedents in place, etc. But it is usually that individual whose case comes forwards who feels, well, I don't know if she feels that she benefits, but it feels like the benefit is to the individual. So over and above litigation, what else is going on in the UK in terms of work on state responsibility and accountability?
Well, I'm probably in some ways not the best person to talk about that because I am a lawyer, and that is, in many ways, regretfully, on my part, that's the role I play. There certainly are organisations, and there is a resurgence of feminism amongst younger women, which is a really fantastic thing to see. I don't know if there's any organisations here that can talk about what they're doing. One thing that has happened is that a lot of people who were campaigners in the 80s, and to be honest, but I guess I fall in this category too, but from a slightly different route, but a lot of the campaigners in the 80s became providers of services, and they have been funded, they've become sort of professionalised, and one of the things I've been doing a series of sort of workshops with women's organisations, and they're saying, you know, we kind of need to get back to being the campaigners. We've become part of the sort of front line. I take up our time dealing with the immediate problem, a bit like you're explaining, Mara, and become the blaster. And we need the new generation of women doing the fighting. And I think, you know, I don't know what the answer is. In the immediate answer is, as in there's the organisation, but absolutely we do need that struggle on the ground. There's no change will happen. It will only happen piecemeal without the fighting on the ground. I mean, we know there are workshops today that are talking about the sort of campaigning side of things, so perhaps some of the answers will be provided there. There may be people in the audience who can.
I'm under orders that there are no more questions. The workshops have to begin. The one thing before doing that I'd like to do is to thank you all for being here, but especially to thank our 3 extraordinary speakers, and to say if the title is The State Against Women and Women's Bodies, then with the activities of women like this, the state doesn't stand a chance.